The message arrived just before dawn over Reykjavik, bouncing through every planetary relay with the dull formality of a diplomatic audit. Its tone was clinical, almost bored, language that had been passed through so many layers of policy sanitization it no longer sounded like a demand. But Jack Morrison had read enough decrees from the Galactic Council to recognize the shape behind the words. This wasn't arbitration, it was ultimatum. Earth was to relinquish its sovereignty in 40 cycles or face strategic disarmament by sanctioned force implementation. The words were empty, but the vectors weren't. 24 dreadnoughts had already been spotted breaking drift around the Eridanus Lock, shadowed by 2 carrier-class command barges, massive ships that didn't cross borders for negotiation. Phase line Aurek had gone dark. Earth's orbital telescopes weren't guessing anymore. They were tracking approach trajectories. The fleet was moving slow not out of caution, but because its outcome was considered predetermined. No warning, no resistance, just formal procedure. Sign here, kneel there. Morrison sat alone in a windowless briefing hall 6 levels below what used to be the Geneva Accord Pavilion, now just a reinforced shell retooled for climate stabilization. The room was silent except for the soft click of manual key confirmation as he pulled up Valgate, a protocol so old it still used compressed binary trees for authentication. He didn't pause to consider diplomatic response. There was no need. Earth had no fleets to mobilize, no planetary shields to raise, no allies to appeal to. What it did have were systems built during the paranoia years, those 3 decades of Earth's post-collapse history when every government believed the next impact would be extinction level, and built accordingly. Most of those systems were shut down during the fiscal consolidation era, buried, decommissioned, scrubbed from budget ledgers and orbital transparency agreements. But some had been repurposed, not to protect Earth, but to make sure the cost of stepping on it would never be worth it. Morrison's fingers hovered over the Valgate interface, waiting for the last node sync from the outer Siberian basin. A faint green flicker confirmed the link. 6 dormant sites responded in sequence, each buried under the camouflage of economic ruin and sensor white noise corridors, old geothermal grids, scorched pre-collapse city cores, arc silos gutted during the bioprocess rebellion. To any external scan, they were long-dead infrastructure, useless, non-functional. That was the point. They weren't designed for operation. They were designed for resurrection under one specific condition, when no diplomatic vector remained. Morrison didn't speak as the last indicator locked. There was nothing to say. Protocol Valgate didn't activate weapons. It didn't fire signals into space or scramble units to front lines. It simply confirmed readiness of Earth's final fallback mechanisms, systems that weren't meant to win wars. They were meant to end attempts. There were no security alarms, no sirens, no flashing lights. The planet didn't bristle in defiance. Nothing stirred in low orbit. Surface traffic continued its routines, vertical hydro farms shifting to morning calibration, Pacific desalination rings rotating towards solar convergence. But deep beneath those cycles, something old began to move. Cooling cores hummed awake in long-dead bunkers. Relay nodes flicked online in drainage tunnels mistaken for flood systems. Atmospheric scrubbers recalibrated not to optimize oxygenation, but to redirect thermal exhaust into sensor-safe corridors. The planet itself remained still, a quiet, dull marble in a dark system. But inside the bones of its surface, Earth began to adjust. Morrison moved to the operations table and tapped in the staggered sync for ghost grid simulation. On the surface, nothing would appear different. But to anyone running sensor sweeps, Earth would now emit decay patterns consistent with collapsing infrastructure, as if its power reserves were overdrawn and critical systems were failing. It would read, correctly, as a planet past its prime, too broken to mount organized resistance. That misread was critical. For the Council to proceed with arrogance, they had to believe the outcome was a foregone conclusion, victory through paperwork, not battle. He exited the chamber without issuing a directive. There were no soldiers to brief, no speeches to record. His staff would know what to do. Those still in the continuity division had been handpicked not for loyalty, but for ability to follow a protocol chain under blackout. They didn't need inspiration. They needed alignment. Above ground, the pale sky over Europe was beginning to fade into overcast. Morrison passed by the rusted exterior of what used to be the old UN's planetary coordination ring, now hollowed out for microclimate control. A child kicked a stone across the plaza as he walked past. She didn't know what was coming. That was fine. She wouldn't have to. Somewhere far above, beyond Earth's failed satellites and decaying debris orbitals, the Council's observation skiffs continued relaying scans. They would find no movement worth noting, no fleet mobilizations, no thermal spikes. They would assume, as designed, that Earth was accepting the terms. They would log that Earth had not responded to the surrender decree within the expected temporal window, that no diplomatic outreach had been returned, that orbital defense readings were sub-baseline, that the planet was a soft target, quiet, compliant, and finished. But beneath decommissioned flood control stations in the Equatan, Oriole Trench, an old processor flickered online and transmitted the first node echo into the planetary mesh. Valgate had been received. 6 green lights, all clear. The echo wasn't audible, but if it had been, it would have sounded like breath returning to lungs that had never forgotten how to inhale. Morrison stood at the top of the buried core relay shaft outside the Nora fault line in Lapland, arms folded behind his back as wind tugged gently at his coat. His aide stepped beside him, tablet in hand. Confirmation returned from Site 4, he said quietly. Full sync achieved. Morrison nodded once. He didn't look up at the sky. He didn't need to. The orbitals would fill soon enough. The Council would descend, expecting to find a world too tired to resist. They wouldn't find resistance. They'd find arrangement. He turned back toward the hardened entrance of the facility, the autolock closing behind him with a soft click. Earth's war didn't start with battle. It started with a checklist, and the final box had just been marked. The Galactic Council fleet breached the heliopause like a shadow slipping over glass, calm, continuous, and certain of its welcome. Their approach wasn't cloaked. It didn't have to be. Protocol dictated they maintain transponder activity within contested zones to signal transparency and legitimacy. 24 dreadnoughts moved in staggered formation, each one radiating so much gravitational displacement that Earth's outer tracking stations didn't even need visual confirmation. They could feel the compression effects across ionosphere drift patterns. The supercarriers followed at calculated delay, positioned just outside the range of conventional retaliation, because, according to all known simulations, Earth had none. The fleet wasn't advancing toward a battlefield. It was arriving at a sentence, ready to be carried out. The first Council scan requests lit up in low-orbit receivers just past Mars Drift. Forward observers, orbiting and recon skiffs, expected to receive early confirmation of Earth's surrender protocol. Some variation of what was required, a code stack nested in a planetary checksum envelope, followed by a ground command broadcast. What they received instead was a wash of low-frequency code clusters. It resembled surrender. It sounded close enough, but it wasn't clean. There were too many redundancies in the structure, too many retranslations embedded in the metadata. It was as if Earth had sent a broken version of capitulation, confused maybe, or improperly assembled. The Council scanners flagged it for human error, a misfire from a collapsing command structure, nothing more. The pattern had been seen before in low-tier colonies that lacked central coordination. Earth's surrender, by their assumption, had simply been sloppy. But there was nothing accidental in it. Program Ashwake had begun. From behind the veil of orbital trash, a different system was moving. Earth's atmosphere was layered with millions of abandoned satellites, torn mesh panels, cooling husks, and rusted transceivers from a dozen dead decades. No empire could afford to clear it, and no empire had dared question why Earth had never cleaned its low-orbit lanes. Ashwake depended on that assumption. Buried within that junk field, deep in casings that emitted no thermal signature and carried no active beacon, were signal arrays constructed from old Council firmware, recovered, reverse-engineered, and buried inside Earth's ghost satellites during the compliance treaties. Over the years, Earth had listened, adapted, and archived every variation of Council diplomatic cipher it could intercept. Ashwake used that raw data to fabricate plausible deception, signals that looked authentic at first glance but couldn't be verified without direct physical access. That access would never come. The arrays were mobile, programmed to drift, bounce, and reposition on atmospheric cues. The Council would be chasing ghosts across Earth's orbital graveyard. While Council AI flagged the surrender signals as valid but incomplete, the real maneuvering began. A sequence of old derelicts, hollowed-out frames designed to look like heat-scarred mining platforms, reoriented their spin vectors and began aligning with fixed trajectories. Inside them were no engines, no crew modules, no electronics at all. Only hardened tungsten rods, each weighing several tons, each carefully magnetically locked to a release cradle tuned for minimal trace emission. They were kinetic rods, technologically primitive by interstellar standards, which made them invisible to the heuristic scans designed to detect fusion pulse emissions or exotic weapon cores. The Council wasn't looking for inert mass, they were looking for intent. Morrison had given them neither. Back on Earth, inside the fortified ice bastion beneath the Ross Shelf, Morrison walked without escort through the subglacial corridor that hadn't been accessed in 23 years. The Exo-State delegation hadn't officially existed since the Coastal Restructure Accords, but Morrison knew they hadn't disbanded, only retreated. Their authority was no longer political. It was architectural. They held the keys to the Geosync override grid, a now illegal planetary failsafe initially developed to rebalance Earth's geothermal instability, but since modified into something far less benign. The room was dim, not out of secrecy but conservation. Every system in the facility ran on redirected glacial seep, converted through turbine and thermal pressure loops. The delegation greeted Morrison without ceremony. No salute, no questions, only access. They'd been waiting. He signed no orders. No one spoke of retaliation. Their interaction wasn't military. It was procedural. The codes were verified, the root-level access logged, and the override grid was quietly brought into standby. Its systems would remain cold until they weren't. Above them, Earth's surface grid began to shift, not with urgency, not in panic. Systems dimmed, not offline but throttled. Power nodes rerouted to critical legacy systems. Civilian networks were pruned for unnecessary bandwidth. Utility districts shifted into latent cycle calibration. From orbit it would look like decline, power starvation, decaying infrastructure, old Earth shedding its final pretense of resistance. That illusion was essential. The Council expected a crumbling world. It needed to see what it expected. Down in the southern hemisphere, weather control drones subtly reprogrammed to allow for chaotic patterning. Dust clouds were redirected toward orbital scan paths. Static interference zones re-established themselves over former military communication corridors. All of it carefully timed, randomized just enough to seem unintentional. The Council, confident in its superiority, interpreted the data as instability. But instability was a weapon too, if you built it right. Back in the ESCD war room, Morrison reviewed the scan overlays one last time. The Council wasn't preparing for a strike. They were waiting for Earth's reply. The nature of that reply, whether surrender, resistance, or delay, would dictate the final deployment model. They didn't realize Earth's reply had already been issued. The misread surrender codes were not a delay tactic. They were the tactic. Ashwake had been designed not just to fool sensors, but to set the tempo. A strategic lie, layered so deep in plausibility it would force the enemy to adapt to your fiction. and adaptation took time. That time was Earth's only currency, no. Every second the Council delayed to interpret what it believed was Earth's hesitation was a second that aligned another rod, recalibrated another plasma core, synced another fallback corridor. The real war hadn't begun, not by Earth's standards. It had already been won, if they could hold the illusion long enough. By the 6th day after the decree, the Galactic Council's command AI began issuing quiet advisories, low-priority warnings that didn't rise to the level of emergency, but repeated with just enough frequency to generate discomfort across the fleet's administrative layers. Surface readings on Earth were no longer stable. There were anomalies too subtle to classify, minor geothermal spikes near dormant fault zones, synchronized blackout clusters in major civilian grids, and a sudden reconfiguration of satellite broadcast nodes that disrupted typical packet sequencing. None of it triggered combat alerts. Nothing broke treaty parameters. The data pointed in every direction but hostility. To the military systems on board the dreadnoughts, it was noise, environmental, possibly organic, most likely the result of a degraded planetary control network. To the Council's political factions watching from the observation decks of the lead carriers, it was something else entirely. It felt like staging, and staging without intent was never just coincidence. Meetings began to break protocol structure. Advisors debated openly, not in secure channels, but across committee networks. Some urged delay, invoking clause reviews from previous planetary audits. Others argued that pausing now, after mobilizing such an overwhelming force, would send the wrong signal to both Earth and the Council's peripheral systems, many of which were already on edge after the failed assimilation campaigns along the Draven corridor. The optics were clear. If Earth was allowed to delay the surrender process, as without punishment, every Tier 2 and Tier 3 colony watching would follow suit. Authority didn't collapse from loss, it collapsed from hesitation. And so even as data scientists raised questions about Earth's subgrid behavior, even as senior fleet tacticians flagged pattern drift in Earth's surface sync pulses, the political factions leaned forward. If Earth was stalling, it was only because it feared the consequences. That meant pressure should be increased, not relieved. That was when Signal Atria arrived. No one knew when the first line appeared. It didn't come through military channels. It wasn't encrypted, flagged, or even labeled as communication. It simply existed, a line of text embedded in the diagnostic outputs of the Council's own fleet software, where calibration updates and thermal scans scrolled in real time. A single name, a planetary coordinate, a time of destruction. At first it was assumed to be a legacy file, a corrupted artifact from a mispatched update. But then the second line appeared, then the third. Each one followed the same structure: name, coordinate, timestamp. No commentary, no demands, just a rhythm of remembrance. By the time the 8th line appeared, several officers recognized the names. They weren't random. They were Earth's lost colonies. Sites burned, glassed, or abandoned during past conflicts, most of which had been erased from Council records, denied as accidents, or attributed to local mismanagement. But Earth hadn't forgotten. The data stream expanded, spilling across visual diagnostics, audio calibrations, even into the maintenance overlays of Council-issued helmets. Every name linked to a point in space the Council had hoped was buried. The lists were precise, immaculately verified, time-coded, verified against stellar drift, not accusation, not fiction, record. Soon the litany shifted. The language changed from singular records to collective acknowledgement. The phrasing grew ritualistic. Instead of raw data, the lines became eulogies. The syntax matched Earth's archaic mourning forms, spoken traditions rendered in binary and then slipped into the digital bloodstream of the enemy's fleet. By the time senior analysts recognized the pattern, it was too late. The Council's command AI had already indexed the data as low threat, replicable, and passed it downstream to all vessel systems. Fleet-wide exposure was total. The final message arrived with perfect timing. No visual element, no accompanying tone. Just one final sentence appearing across every ship's internal telemetry summary in standard Council diplomatic format. Prepare burial permissions for 24 vessels. It wasn't a threat. It was logistics. The impact wasn't kinetic. It was institutional. Military commanders understood that no orbital weapons had been fired, no energy signatures aligned with assault, but the diplomatic envoys aboard the carriers understood what Earth had just done. This was not a warning. It was a receipt. Earth wasn't offering resistance. It was acknowledging outcome. Every signal the Council had received up to now hadn't been a stall tactic. It had been prelude. The old colonies were not forgotten. Their destruction was not forgiven. The permission request wasn't rhetorical. Earth was asking the Council to confirm how many bodies they were prepared to lose. Panic didn't start in the war rooms. It started in the offices of quorum liaisons, where reputation and trajectory mattered more than victory. Diplomats argued over interpretation. Was the message literal? Symbolic? Was Earth attempting psychological deterrence, or did it have a system capable of making good on such a declaration? Analysts searched for correlating threat vectors, but the fleet's surveillance showed no mobilization. Earth's orbital posture remained unchanged, and that was the final unease. Nothing had changed. No DNOs, offenses, no fleets, no movement, only acceptance. The dreadnought captains submitted readiness confirmations, each one a formality. The deadline set by the Council's decree was 37 cycles. 36 had passed. To retreat now, in the face of silence, would be a humiliation the Council could not afford. Earth's lack of reply had already strained quorum consensus. Signal Atria reframed that silence as calculated. If they turned back, it would confirm Earth's superiority through inaction. Dissent was the only remaining option, not because it made strategic sense, but because to do otherwise was political self-termination. And so the order was issued. Descent trajectory locked, fleet vectors aligned, atmospheric breach planned for the 37th cycle, synchronized to local planetary dawn. The time chosen not by Earth, but by Council protocol. They believed they still controlled the schedule. They didn't realize Earth had already written the final line. The first dreadnought breached the thermosphere as dawn spread across Earth's western arc. The hull shimmered under controlled descent fields, radiant and slow, descending like a temple carved from alloy and momentum. High above, 23 others aligned their own vectors, staggered across multiple hemispheric approach lanes. No warning signals were issued from the planet. No orbital defenses came online. To the Council's command interface, the invasion appeared to be moving according to timeline. Atmospheric compression sensors ticked within normal variance. Planetary comms remained dead. The surface was silent, visually, thermally, politically. Earth hadn't moved, not an inch. That's why no one noticed what had changed. Inside the subterranean command center beneath the remnants of the new Andes terraform hub, Morrison stood motionless in front of a manual confirmation terminal. A single key press, plain, analog, and unaided by artificial interface, executed. Protocol Elictor. The lights in the chamber didn't flicker. No alarms sounded. The command didn't initiate a launch because nothing needed launching. Earth's reply had already been positioned, aimed, and disguised. All Lichter did was lift the veil. In low orbit, Ashwake reversed its signal pattern. The mimic net, which had spent the last 4 cycles broadcasting decaying surrender code in just enough variations to confuse verification AI, now surged into full inversion. Every node, from the disguised satellite arrays to the spoofed legacy transponders, activated a counter-pattern flood designed to saturate Council sensors with corrupted metadata. Friend or foe identifiers looped back onto themselves. Internal designations cross-tagged adjacent ships. Automated targeting systems on the dreadnoughts began flagging one another as hostile, then friendly, then hostile again. Fail-safe routines attempted to restore control by resetting vector locks, but Ashwake had anticipated that too. Each signal cycle was loaded with misalignment echo. The fleet's own systems began to consume themselves in a spiral of trust failure. Within seconds, the first rods fell. The kinetic strikes made no sound. They didn't burn through the atmosphere like a cinematic barrage. There were no contrails, no detonations, no lights. Just weight. Silent, controlled weight moving at 10 kilometers per second. 240 tungsten rods, each one free-falling from hollowed derelicts that had spent months drifting in what the Council believed was orbital garbage. Each impact wasn't random, nor was it meant to destroy. They landed with surgical cruelty, targeting the outermost maneuvering rings, the propulsion shrouds, and the long spine antennae arrays critical for fleet-wide coordination. There were no energy emissions to trace, no missile plumes to detect. The rods simply arrived, tearing through vital systems without triggering traditional defense logic. Some dreadnoughts tilted off course by degrees, a drift unnoticeable at first. Others lost steering altogether. Comms stuttered. Internal nav grids reported false elevation readings. Within 79 seconds, the entire advance wave of the Council fleet had lost formation integrity. Then the descent corridors ignited. The geosync override grid, once a stabilizing platform for atmospheric regulation, now functioned as Earth's most unorthodox weapon. Reconfigured years prior under Morrison's authority, it had been redesigned not to disperse heat, but to generate it. At precise intervals across 5 of the 8 atmospheric corridors the Council had mapped for safe descent, thermal exhaust relays surged open and flooded the path with plasma generated from planetary core siphons. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't fire at targets. It simply altered the environment enough that any object descending through those layers would encounter unresolvable variants. 2 dreadnoughts entered those zones mid-drop and began to vaporize, first in systems, then in frame. The process wasn't explosive. It was annihilative. Armor liquefied. Stabilizers curled inward. Command bridges disappeared into compression walls dense enough to warp internal structure before emergency power could cycle. The Tavrix, the Council's flagship supercarrier, recognized the unfolding collapse and attempted a course reversal. Its engines spun too late. Locked into descent geometry, it pivoted hard starboard and clipped one of its escorts, Dreadnought Helvan, still paralyzed from its comms array being pulverized by a rod strike. The collision wasn't catastrophic by energy standards, but momentum at that altitude did the reses. Both ships rolled into orbital tumble. Their automated stabilization systems initiated emergency burn, but within Ashwake's interference field, their targeting loops misfired. Thrusters fought each other. Final course: uncontrolled descent. Back on Earth, Morrison watched a single indicator change color. A transmission had been received by the Council's remaining command layer, those not yet swallowed by spin or disarray. It wasn't a message in the traditional sense. No voice, no video. Just one encrypted file packet, sent across the highest diplomatic priority channel permitted under interstellar law. The file was titled, Burial Ledger, Receipt of Incoming. Inside the file, a list, 24 ship names, assigned descent trajectories, projected time of impact, all marked in past tense. Each entry was notarized, time-stamped, and filed under Earth Strategic Continuity Division authority. There were no threats, no rhetoric, just numbers and outcomes, filed like inventory awaiting closure. The Council Command Corps didn't acknowledge the file. There was nothing left to say. Above them, ships continued to fall, not because Earth had fired on them, but because Earth had written a scenario where traditional definitions of firepower no longer applied. Every assumption the Council had brought, about strength, about visibility, about what constituted resistance, had been used against them. Earth hadn't deployed a fleet. It hadn't launched missiles or raised planetary shields. It had rearranged the battlefield to ensure that when the enemy arrived, the very rules they fought by would dismantle them. There was no glory in what followed, No cheering, no defiant broadcasts, no triumphant anthem. Earth didn't announce its survival. It let gravity do the talking. The retreat order came late, not as a declaration, but as a silent redirection of fleet trajectories away from Earth's gravity well. There were no press conferences or priority dispatches from the Council's strategic command. No memorials were issued for the names that had burned in low orbit. No admission that an invasion force had been dismantled without a single planetary shot being fired. The first official explanation came in the form of a single phrase, distributed across all diplomatic channels and media outlets. Unexpected navigational disruption resulting in catastrophic orbital miscalculation. The term was chosen carefully, crafted to sound sterile and plausibly deniable. It blamed no one. It implied no confrontation. And most importantly, it implied Earth had done nothing at all. But the internal chatter told a different story. Within the Central Quorum archives, Earth's designation changed, first quietly, then unanimously, from post-sovereign containment class to Tier Z conditional threat. That classification was rare. It existed only on the books for theoretical catastrophes, rogue AIs, weaponized physics anomalies, failed Dyson shells. Earth's placement on that list wasn't a punishment. It was a protective measure, an official admission that further engagement might trigger consequences the Council could neither predict nor contain. The designation was buried in encrypted military channels, inaccessible to the public. It wasn't meant for deterrence. It was a firewall, the Council's way of acknowledging that Earth was no longer part of the equation. On the ground, Earth remained quiet. No broadcasts were issued, no claim of victory, no demand for negotiation, no diplomatic response of any kind. Channels that once eagerly fought for recognition now simply closed. Morrison made no speech. The ESCD remained entirely silent. Earth had achieved what it needed. Strategic invisibility reinforced by catastrophic consequence. Any further communication would only compromise that position. Silence now was the most dangerous signal they could send. And yet, the silence began to attract attention. In the weeks that followed the fleet's retreat, isolated outposts along the galactic periphery, systems that had once existed on the margins of Council supply lines, began reaching out through quiet, encrypted requests. Not alliances, not treaties, logistics, requests for Terran-manufactured modules, outdated by Council standards but renowned for durability and failure tolerance. Former colony worlds that had been neglected during expansion years now asked for old Earth-grade stabilization matrices, grain storage hubs, and synthetic climate regulators. No one mentioned the battle. No one used the word surrender. But every request was time-stamped after the Council's withdrawal. Every message arrived without a Council seal attached. Morrison read them all and issued no response. Earth would not rise as a new empire. That wasn't the point. The point was erosion, of myth, of hierarchy, of belief. Earth's retaliation hadn't struck the Council's fleet. It had struck the very doctrine that fleet operated under. Doctrine that assumed strength was visible, power was scalable, and control came from presence. Earth had inverted it all. Presence had meant nothing. Strength had misled. And control, real control, had come from understanding the shape of fear, then arranging events so the enemy walked into it willingly. Inside military academies across the core systems, new syllabi were written. Elective programs were turned mandatory. A new simulation model, classified under threat of expulsion, was quietly introduced to the elite war colleges. It had no battlefields, no fleet engagement, no defined enemy. The students were given a fictional planetary Tintoms heater where no resistance was visible and asked to complete the objectives within a fixed time limit. Those who advanced with traditional strategies failed immediately. Only those who hesitated, who questioned the absence of conflict, who recognized asymmetry not as lack but as intent, passed. The scenario was based on Earth. It became known unofficially as the surrender model. Cadets whispered about it. Instructors denied it existed in official curriculum. But across the upper levels of strategic command training, everyone learned the lesson. You don't invade a silence you don't understand. Back in the heart of the ESCD command complex, Morrison stood in the observation alcove, watching data feeds without reaction. No celebration accompanied the sensor logs, no comms from surface governments, no rise in orbital traffic. Earth continued its routines as if nothing had changed. Hydroponic towers ticking through solar calibrations, ocean desalinization rigs humming through dawn cycles, urban zones maintaining rationed lighting protocols. The people were not told what had happened. They didn't need to be. For them, the absence of destruction was explanation enough. For Morrison, the outcome had never been about spectacle. The victory wasn't in the impact. It was in the rewiring of perspective. From now on, every species that looked at Earth would see a world that responded to extinction with a form letter, a planet whose silence couldn't be parsed, whose dead infrastructure could outthink military doctrine, and whose reply to a demand for surrender was a notarized funeral receipt. And that was the damage that mattered. Not the dreadnoughts broken in atmosphere, not the plasma-locked descent lanes, but the Council's realization that the very framework they relied on, predictive superiority, technological margin, psychological dominance, had been used against them. Earth hadn't met their strength with force. It had treated force as a variable to be reprogrammed, and when the final ledger was reviewed, Morrison's strategy hadn't just bent the rules. It had quietly redefined what rules even meant. In the growing quiet, surrounded by blinking panels and quiet operations staff, Morrison simply turned away from the screens and left the room. The void had claimed what it needed. Now Earth would let the silence speak for itself. There was no footage of the destruction, no official timestamp of when the Council's last vessel broke orbit, no visual montage of debris fields or triumphant planetary banners raised in defiance. Earth never acknowledged the event publicly. But something began to circulate, slowly at first, then with deliberate consistency. It didn't come from Earth's press channels or any known relay. It appeared inside academic forums, archive requests, strategic war logs, and AI-curated incident digests. A file, uniform in structure, minimal in form. It bore no seal, no encryption, no metadata signature. Just a list, ship names, assigned command numbers, and orbital decay coordinates matched to planetary timestamps. Each line marked the final known vector of a Council vessel lost during the descent. Dreadnoughts, carriers, escorts, some flagged as missing in action, others with verified impact trajectories. The format was spare but precise. There were no adjectives, no commentary, just data, compiled and labeled under a cold heading. Obituary, Council Descent Response, Earth Sector. Below every ship's entry, the same closing sentence repeated in quiet finality. Contact denied, return discouraged. The Council never formally responded to the document, but internally, military communications were halted. No further tactical missions near Terran orbital space were authorized. Patrols scheduled along phase line Aurek were rerouted. Brief conflicts at outer colonies, once justified by failure to comply with Council directives, faded. What had once been routine enforcement dissolved into silence. And as that silence spread, it turned into something deeper. Hesitation. No new treaties were attempted, no embargoes imposed. Outer systems, watching carefully, noted the Council's new behavior and drew their own conclusions. Where once Earth was spoken of as a derelict world of decline, now it was whispered of as a place that didn't react, didn't explain, didn't engage, a place that processed incursions as finalities. A planet whose dead infrastructure answered invasions with silence and whose reply to strategic dominance was a ledger of wreckage. In the following months, that list, the obituary, became reference material. Not officially, not within Council channels, But in sideline lectures, war theory simulations, and private command briefings, the file appeared. Cadets who accessed it rarely admitted doing so. But word spread. The format was copied, its minimalist language studied. Not because it conveyed emotion, it didn't, but because it revealed a different kind of warfare, one that used memory as ammunition and administrative tone as a scalpel. No one challenged Earth's silence again. Morrison remained at the ESCD's core facility, overseeing nothing. There were no operations left to run. The systems were stable. Surface populations moved forward without knowing how close their world had come to being rewritten. There were no parades, no declarations. Most of Earth remained unaware that anything had happened, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. What Morrison had built was not a deterrent based on fear. It was a language, a system of reply encoded not in weapons, but in certainty. The obituary wasn't a statement. It was a protocol. A cold, repeatable closure cycle, and that was its real power. Earth didn't need to say anything. The entries were the message. The silence after them was the instruction. Late in the 6th week, a new diplomatic transmission appeared in Morrison's personal queue. It was marked High Urgency, flagged B. 3 separate council entities, each routing through non-traditional protocols to avoid quorum filtering. The content of the message was never known. Morrison didn't open it. He scanned the header once, eyes resting on the chain of route tags, proof that the council was still trying to understand what had gone wrong, still hoping there was someone on Earth willing to respond. He deleted the message unread. At that moment, across thousands of archived instances in academic clouds, war simulation logs, and subterranean databanks where copies of the obituary had been stored, a final line appeared, synchronized, confirmed, immutable. This entry concludes Earth's reply. No follow-up transmission came. No one sent another request. The silence resumed, full, absolute, and final.